Hello, this is Cotton Soups and welcome back to another video. This video is going to be on me ranking every single Sweet Retreat Lumion. Obviously, there are a bunch of other stuff you can put in this video, like pre-evolutions, but I'm not including those because they're pre-evolutions. They're not really meant to be used in PvP anyways. So yeah, first off, you might notice a Swirelle in the Swirelle tier, and that's mainly because Swirelle is too inconsistent to rank. Swirelle is not going to be doing the same thing every single battle. Sure, your RNG might be God, but it's not going to be the same for everyone. So yeah, Swirelle is not really the best because it's not in the other tiers. It's basically a gimmick. It's not the best or the worst, it's just a gimmick, so don't really worry about Swirelle too much. So, yeah, just to remember, Swirl is actually considered an Uber. So yeah, that is a thing to consider. But overall, yeah, Swirl is a Lumion that's a gimmick. It's not really meant for competitive PvP, which is what I'm ranking today. So yeah, let's start off with a decent option, and it's actually Mocho. Mocho, I think, is a very good meta contender. Obviously, it does have a lot of competition, mainly the range wall breakers, stuff like Zeppelin, Wintrix, Pyrolin, and I guess you can count Himber as competition too. But particularly, I think its coverage is pretty strong. Deep Freeze does let it hit a bunch of the water types like Luminami, Barblast, Tsukame, Kanibo, which is overall pretty great. And of course, Boom Bash lets it hit stuff like Tyrex, Valkyrie. It can really hurt Stratosaur with a very smart Boom Bash Martial Shell, so that's something you should take into consideration. Also, it can deal with Setamors, which is obviously pretty good. It can try and set up against stuff like Venilin, and it can do pretty well against Tundralin as well. So, I think Mocho is a pretty good wall breaker, but it does struggle with getting into the battle because it is a pure ice type. It's not the best defensive typing, and it kind of needs support, outside support like pivots, like the newest Lumion, Phagenot, Iliguana, stuff like that, as well as Ursnac. So yeah, I think Meta Contenders is a perfect place for Mocho. And I think Ursnac also fits in this role. Just like Mocho, it does have a lot of uses, but not really, because it's only used for one thing and one thing only, and that is to pivot in wall breakers. Ursnac hasn't really found a special place other than pivoting wall breakers, so yeah, it's kind of bad for Ursnac because as of right now, the wall breakers that are common, stuff like Pyrolin, Wintrix, Meditoad, Zeppelin, and some other stuff, can already switch in on their own. And while Ursnac definitely can benefit them, it's just the argument of why would you run Ursnac when they can already switch in, provide more utility, and you can have something on your team like a Phagenot, a Tyrex, Stratosaur, many of the other Metalumians instead of Ursnac, because Ursnac can only provide one thing only, and that's just to baffle out. It is the best at what it does, don't get me wrong, but in this metagame, most of the stuff are bulky, and it's either that or it's hyper offense, so I kind of guess it does fit in into that role of a pivot in hyper offense. So yeah, I think Meta Contender is a pretty good spot for it. Argue with me in the comments. Seedrake. I think Seedrake is a good average Lumion. It's not really the best because of its coverage. While its melee attack stat is okay, it's like really good. It does have to compete with stuff like Meditoad, believe it or not. And with its role, which can be a barter, sweeper, or cleaner, depending on how you look at it, or it can set up. The main problem with Seedrake here is that it's kind of in the weird of a middle ground that is because of its plant typing. If it literally got any other typing, then it would probably be a lot more better, because the plant typing as of right now sucks. It has a lot of weaknesses to fire, ice, bug, dark, toxic, which are all very common in the metagame, so obviously Seedrake's not going to have a great time with that. Obviously, it's a wall breaker at heart. I do believe it's like a wall breaker in one of its roles, but obviously, if it's gonna have to wall break, it needs to have some sort of defensive stats to actually help it wall break and win the 1v1. And it's also not as strong enough to one shot a lot of the walls. So yeah, it's kind of hard for Seedrake in my opinion. The thing that brings it down is that its versatility. if you want to use its plant stab, its new plant stab, then you particularly have to run barter, or like not barter, but you have to run boots on it, because or you have to run boots and anomaly, because well, if you run bulk up on it, anomaly is gonna cancel that out and make your defenses and attack lower. And if you do not want to run anomaly, then that -1 melee attack on your plant stab is basically useless. It's just a really complicated thing for Seedrake. It kind of wants to be one thing, but it wants to be another. And it just provides a really low point of where you want to use the other form, but it also wants to use the other form, and it kind of clashes in a sense where Seedrake has to, well, try and balance it, and obviously it doesn't really do a good job of it. So yeah, decent to average Lumion. I think it's a pretty good Lumion overall, just not in the other tiers like this. Nymaurae is an example of a meta-worthy Lumion, particularly because just like Seedrake, it has a lot of things it wants to do. It wants to pivot in, it wants to switch out as well as do a lot of damage, it wants to be fast, and overall it can do a lot of those stuff with one singular set. It can do a lot of damage with like a smart focus build with a like defensive investment and some speed. Obviously its speed tier is competitive, but other than that, it has have a high base speed, which lets Nymaurae have a little bit of speed investment to outspeed some of the stuff it does want to outspeed. So overall, Nymaurae is like in a sense a version of Seedrake that can do pretty much anything it wants, and it doesn't have to worry about like damage or something like that. Obviously, you can run a defensive set and expect a lot of damage. Obviously, no. Nymaurae is just an example of a good versatile Lumion. It can do a lot of the things, and it's not like part of its kit is holding Nymaurae back, because personally, Nymaurae has a lot of good tools. Quick recovery is pretty good, as well as its other ability, Incandescent. On top of the fact, Flash and Flee buff, very good for Nymaurae. I guess the only Nymaurae thing that's pretty bad about it is Airblade. It's not really good in that stab, but other than that, Nymaurae is pretty good. It can be a defensive pivot, it can be your offensive pivot that can like provide the pressure in hyper offense teams. It obviously can be a cleaner or sweeper, just like Seedrake. So yeah, I think Nymaurae is a perfect example of a meta-worthy Lumion. I do think it's one of the best out of these guys. So yeah. Let's talk about some other stuff. Actually, Cinnogre is going to be in a decent average Lumion. It's a different reason from Seedrake, and that's basically because, well, it's basically outclassed by other provoke users. And what I mean is that I personally think that Cinnogre's best set is the provoke Peace of Mind set. You can run Smite, but the thing is, Cinnogre doesn't nearly do enough damage at base level to one hit or two hit KO a wall right after a Smite. Because basically, Smite is useless after the first turn of using it. A 25% damage, obviously, that's not really great on anything. And that's basically your only damage output. And Smite overall is basically good on the first turn because, well, other than that, having the HP over and over is not going to be racking up a lot of damage soon. Smite is a good ability, but I don't think Cinnogre is a good user of it, considering it's not the fastest, so it can't always get off a Smite first. So yeah, Cinnogre, like I said earlier, outclassed by other Provoke Peace of Mind users, mainly stuff like Zeppelin and Wintrix that bring a lot more to the table. Zeppelin brings Mudslide and Peace of Mind Provoke, and also Wintrix provides its Wise ability and a lot more speed and offensive capabilities. So yeah, Cinnogre's in a weird spot, and I guess you can also say that Pyrelin and Valkyrie and some other stuff like Mocho are a lot better range wall breakers than Cinnogre. So yeah, it's just pretty hard for Cinnogre. And yeah, some other good Lumions that I'll be putting up is Hoganosh and Fiscarna. Fiscarna is pretty good, but I just don't see it making a splash in the metagame. Fiscarna might be a pretty good Lumion depending on its coverage, like if the metagame fits its coverage, whether or not it does have to compete for the water slot with stuff like Luminami, Barblast, and C.B.O. So it's gonna have to compete with that, and obviously it's not really the best at it because while a water type is a pretty good defensive wise, offensive wise it's not really the best. and its coverage kind of helps it out with that, but not really too much. So yeah, decent viable Lumens. It's here, and as well as Hoganosh. Well, I don't think it's in the same tier as like, or like in the same realm of power as Fiscarna. Definitely does have some stuff going for it. Baneful Bash, Mega Chomp, and Fiery Fondant are all pretty good coverage moves. On top of that, it can run support moves like Burn Up to get rid of barbs, and Rejuvenate to, well, heal off the damage. It's a pretty good wall, or rather, it's a pretty good Lumion that has good defenses and can hit pretty hard as well. It's obviously not going to be hitting the hardest stuff like compared to stuff like Seedrake, which is its main competition, and it obviously doesn't provide as much utility as something like Chartiki does. So overall, I think Hoganosh is a pretty good Lumion. I do think it's better than these guys, or rather, Seedrake might be above this tier. So yeah, I think that's pretty fair. Bunnecki and Spreezy, or rather Bunnecki here. Bunnecki is a pretty bad Lumion. Now, it's an average Lumion in a sense where it's basically average at what it does. It's outclassed by some other stuff, which is not really the best if you really want to make a name for yourself. And what I mean by that is Bunnecki is in a weird spot. Bunnecki is in a really competitive speed tier where a bunch of stuff is running nimble or running smart or running very nimble. And obviously, Bunnecki can run very nimble too. It is accessible to rallyable personalities. But what's the worst thing about Bunnecki is that it basically has to compete with those stuff. And if it does want to run very nimble, it's not going to be dealing as much damage because its range attack stat is pretty low for something this fast. And of course, that's pretty bad also. And if you do want to run very smart, you're going to get outsped by those stuff. And then it's basically pointless if you try to and run a lot of speed to outspeed those stuff, and you're just going to get outsped in the end. Obviously, very nimble is its best personality, but overall, Bunnecki doesn't do a lot of damage on its base attack. And what's even worse is that it kind of needs a lot of setup to do so. While its typing kind of does help it out with that, Bunnecki is really, really frail. And unless you're going up against something that cannot touch you, Bunnecki is going to be having a lot of a hard time with that. So yeah. And the last Lumion that I'll be talking about is Spreezy. Well, I do definitely think that Spreezy is a pretty good Lumion. I just think it's the worst out of all these guys. I do believe that Spreezy kind of has of a defined role compared to Cinnogre, but other than that, I don't really think it has anything else going for it. Not Peace Mind, but Pestilence, Sap Plant, or whatever it has, is a good combo, but the meta has shapen to a point where you really need pure damage, like on turn 1, or at least a couple of turns, or rather one turn after. Spreezy doesn't offer that. It's basically a stall Lumion, and with the stuff that's common right now, like Stratosaur, Snagoop, Zeppelin, Wintrix, all great stuff that can take advantage of it, as well as stuff like Himber, pretty good for it as well, and some Mocho also being pretty good for it, and Nymaurae also being pretty good for it as well. It's just really hard when the metagame has a lot of air types, has a lot of metal types, and arguably a bunch of ice types like Tundralin, Himber, Wintrix. It's just very hard for Spreezy to get something going when the meta is basically against it. So yeah. Overall, I think this tier list is pretty solid. I do think that there is a couple of spots you can switch, like Hoganosh being a bit lower than Seedrake, and maybe Bunnecki a little bit higher. But overall, this is my opinion. If you want to argue with me down in the comments, do so. Just be respectful. Provide an actual opinion that hasn't been disproven in what I've said. So yeah. Join the Discord. I do have a Discord server. I'm pretty active there, and we have some pretty good talks there as well. So yeah, like the video, subscribe if you want to see more. I have some great videos that you should check out. So yeah, go into my channel. They're mainly on Lumion dedicated guides, and I did make a guide on Phagenut. So yeah, go check those out as well. And yeah, like the video, subscribe, join the Discord, and remember, Zulong is still a dumpster fire.